Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's my huge delight to be introducing and talking today with Claudine Villemot-Kienzle, who is from the Center for Human Emergence. And as usual, I'm going to start by inviting Claudine to really introduce herself and give us as broad an idea of what it is that she has been doing for the last few decades, which I know is very substantial, and how that brings us up to date. So Claudine, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Indra, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Well, the Center for Human Emergence is an organization I have co-founded, and we are dedicated actually to societal development and future designing, mostly based on an integral and holistic approach. So we explore the ways how we human beings can make the transition, from the old system, the modern and postmodern era, to the integral age. So it's a huge shift and we will need everyone on board, but that's really what we are dedicated to. And to make it also visible and concrete, just as an example, we have developed in the past 10 years a curriculum, so an adult education program named Social Architects, in order to support people with the building of competencies, attitudes, mindsets, that we urgently need right now in order to facilitate the transition. So we have a comprehensive program here to address all dimensions of the human beings, the inner dimensions, but also the outside. How can I, from the inside, with the understanding of who am I in all my dimension, how can I take actions? So it's important for us not just to be in the thinking mode, but also really to go to the outside to co-create and participate actually to the global transition, but on a local level.
It's amazing. And I know that when I say that, I mean, it's because you and I both know that the work that we've been doing is very complementary. But when I'm hearing about what you've engaged with, which is to build this curriculum and to make it available with a new vision, if you like, of change happening from the local level. Immediately, it seems to me that you are talking about something that will appeal to everyone. So can you describe a little bit more? If you were appealing to everyone, how would you describe an integral approach or an integral era?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe what come to mind right now is the idea of potentials and resources. And the idea that we human beings are much more than we think we are. So until the modern era, we have an understanding of ourselves as mostly an ego consciousness. That means that we understand ourselves, our identity is based on the idea that we can think, that we can feel, and we can sense as a body. So the three levels, and that's great. That forms our ego consciousness. And we really need this in order to move here and to create in this duality, in this world. So I love my ego and I love ego consciousness. But at the time we are now, it's not enough. So it was great to develop all these capacities in the ego consciousness, and to get maturity in that. That's very important, to have a mature way of dealing with emotions, with conflicts and all these we are going to be faced, we are going to face every day. But if we really want to go to a more complex level, and our world is growing so complex, we will need additional competencies and capacities. And that's the beginning of defining ourselves as ego dimension, one dimension, but we have more than that. So we have also transpersonal dimensions. We have something that connects us to something bigger. We can name that the spirit, for example, or the essence, and to explore these additional dimensions in us as individual or in the collective, of course, will equip us with possibilities, with potentials that really make it much easier and much joyful, you know, to navigate the complexity. So it's really about building potential capacities beyond what we know right now. And when we are connected with these transpersonal dimensions and consciousness, we will really realize how much easier things become, because we are using different levels for understanding what we see, for connecting, and for co-creating and going in the outside. And that is the essence of the integral age, is that we will develop further qualities, competencies that are perfectly adapted to the complexity of our world. So I have a very pragmatic, you know, connection to what we can say is named the spiritual dimension.
Wonderful, and thank you. That's really well described, and in a way that I haven't heard before in this field. So let me just question some of the assumptions that maybe that you and I would be making, or maybe in the wide, you know, for the wider listening here. When you say that we have these more dimensions, right? How would you distinguish that from, for example, if I were a religious person and I prayed to God, or, you know, in what, how does that compare to the kind of extra dimension that you are describing? So is this just a new way of talking about a spiritual life? Is it just a new language for that spiritual life, or is there a whole new framing of that extra dimension that you've described?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. Well, the idea of spirituality, of something that is bigger than us, but within us, is not something new, of course. I think it is very present in the human evolution. But what is interesting, because I work a lot with the model spiral dynamics integral that describe how we human beings go through our evolution as individuals, but also as whole cultures. And we see here that spirituality was always existent, but was perceived and defined in very different ways. So if we know, you know, the tribes, the animistic tribes and societies were very connected, for example, to nature, and had an understanding of spirituality through spirits and nature. Then we had the times of gods. You know, there were a lot of gods, very powerful, and it's a mythical age. And then we came to the world religions, like Jewish religion and Muslim, where there is one God. So the spirituality was always there, but would take different expression and understanding according to the society they were in. And then in the modern age, after the world religions, that was very structures and in a hierarchy, you know, with the churches, that was a dogma. Then we came to the modern age where spirituality was no longer really existent as a value that would be consciously practiced, because it, of course, the understanding of religion at the time of the Renaissance, you know, was contrary, opposed to the natural sciences, and it was necessary for the sciences to step back from the religion in order to thrive. So all the scientific world, the pragmatical world, on the outside, the physical world, firstly refuse the idea of spirituality, even if many scientific people like Einstein were very spiritual people, you know, but there was some separation that was necessary in order for sciences to emerge. And then in the postmodern, spirituality will be more understood as a philosophy of life, like Buddhism, you know. So that means that we have not one definition of what it is. It always depends on the lens of the culture that is looking at it or experiencing it. But what is interesting right now, if we look at the integral and holistic dimension that are not emergent, as they are not really here in our global diversity, but we can sense them and we can see on the individual level some spots emerging from the integral level and holistic. Here, the spirituality will also have another expression and understanding according to the integral understanding. And it's really, on the integral understanding, it's really the connection of this sense that we have this, let's say, spiritual dimension too, but not defined through a system or a dogma, you know, but it's intrinsic, so it's in us, but also outside us. We are directly connected to the universe. For example, there is a co-creative force in the universe we want to contribute to and support. So it's no longer a person or a dogma. It's a force. It's I would say the universal force or creative force that is within us, also transcending us and uniting all human beings in this creative force of the universe. So it's some bigger vision, I can say, but integrating all what was, and we are not criticizing or saying it's better or it's not better. We're just saying there are different views on that, and it's perfectly okay. And the integral view and understanding of this new dimension, not spiritual new, but the new way of connecting to spirituality is different on this level.
Again, thank you so much for that. It's very, very helpful and quite clear, actually. So the idea that spirituality, that sense of connectedness to something much bigger than us, has evolved. It's evolved in different societies. It's evolved globally as an idea, and now it's possible to tap into that force as a universal force. How much do you feel this has to do also, or is coexistent with the birth of the internet, for example? Can you see that there's some correlation of this idea being something that we can share, which obviously has really accelerated over the last 3 decades because of the birth of the internet? Do you feel that there are correlations, but also do you feel there are implications for that?
Yeah, totally. So I really think that the emergence of the internet, and as you say, the acceleration, it's such an acceleration. I do really believe that the internet and all the technology we have now will empower us when we learn to use them in a proper way, with wisdom, will empower us to come together and will help the convergence. So the emergence is a process where the new comes and manifests. But if we do not converge, we're still trapped in fragmentation. And that's what I see right now. And it relates to the governance topic, because I see so many wonderful, powerful initiatives all around the world, on all continents. And that gives me so much hope to see the new, the integral age coming up and showing its face, you know, I realized at the same time that this diversity and this multiple expression of the new is still not connected. And we lose power and we lose impact. So the next step I want to support with some different people, wonderful people, is now after the emergence process, because I may say we have everything we need right now for the next step and the transition. Wonderful thinking, wonderful people, wonderful connection to bigger dimensions. Everything is here. What we need is now the convergence after the emergence, that we globally come together and map on a global level where are all those wonderful initiatives that really have the potential to bring us to the next level of consciousness and complexity with new models of governance, for example, to map that, to have a global map where we, for example, and I would take the 12 sectors of Vaclav Havel, the wheel of co-creation is a wonderful mapping where people can relate to some fields of societies where they feel really attracted, where they feel that that's my call, my heart's desire. That can be governance, that can be arts, sciences, spirituality, economics, whatever. And then see in my local level, where are those initiatives that are already embodying the new DNA. So it's really about convergence and the internet. To come back to your question, the internet and technology will help us really to connect on a global level, you know, in respect also to the environment with not so much travel expenses and protection of the environment. And so, yes, the internet, the technologies can have the potential to uplift this convergence.
Right. So as the audience won't know that you and I are meeting for the first time, and they might be smiling the way I'm smiling now, because they will know that you and I have been, without meeting each other, been very much in the same world of expectation and connection. So now I'm going to invite you into some of the problems that we see arising, or maybe not problems, but challenges. Mm-hmm. And maybe invite also the other aspect of integral sensibility, which is the 4 quadrants idea. You know, so that when we are looking for convergence, we are always looking for the evidence in a way at the level of all 4 of these quadrants. And so for the audience, we're talking about the moving into relationship, or the being able to see present, you know, an internal capacity for change amongst the people. So if I take myself as an individual, you know, or if everyone takes themselves as an individual, which is valid, how do we move ourselves to that point of internal capacity for this work that you're describing? And then on the other side of that, what are the real world practices, the tools? What are we doing every day to bring this into being? And then on the collective side, which occurs at the same time, there's no separation, you know. I am part of my community, so I have a community self, I have an individual self. These things are not separate from each other. But in my community, there would be this developing culture, the ability to create the context for all of this. And that includes ideas like values, or, you know, ways of being together that I would say probably has language beyond the language of values, because still that we're living in a world where that kind of discussion excludes some people. And then on the other side, in the collective doing action space, what are the structures that can support all of this? So I know we're looking at all of those things, but when we're talking about emergence, there has to be, I think you'll agree, some level of coexistence or appearing manifestation of all of this at once. The ability for individuals to be able to do this, the culture within that an individual can act, the tools and the structures, at any given time across society. We are at different levels of that coming into being. So when you talk about, or when we talk about community and community becoming the possibility of this emergence, maybe where we should give most of our attention as possibility, what occurs to you that is promising, where all of these factors really, in the alternative, we describe this as a sort of I-we world axis, where the full human being meets with the flourishing community and has an impact on the world that is itself good for the whole of the ecosystem. So where would you point at that you think this kind of holistic ecosystem is appearing, say, on the ground?
Yeah. What appears is that, and is promising, is that we need spaces, times and spaces when we can develop and hold this diversity in communities. So it's really also about technologies, because many people are in the individual interior aspect, are very conscious, have worked on themselves, have done, a lot work around consciousness. What is my mindset? But what I see the challenge right now is when we as individuals come together as a collective, as a living organism, that of course the complexity grows with the dynamics of all these individuals with interest and motivation. Yes. And so, so what the challenge will be is to develop competencies and capacities to hold those space on a collective level. And to give a practical example for our audience, Dr. Don Beck, who has developed the spiral dynamics or co-created it, has developed a wonderful technology named meshworks. And we work with that in the Center for Human Emergence with groups, and that's maybe easier to understand as the multi-stakeholders collaboration. That's an approach. Meshwork means to mesh different, you have the vertical and the horizontal lines. And to give a practical example, we had a project in a city on a local level of a community, of a city and a district in the city in Mainz in Germany. And they wanted to explore the topic, the issue of equality as a prerequisite for education, for access education in a digital education. And that was through COVID, a lot of pupils were lost because they had no access to computers and so on, from migrants or other backgrounds, exactly the people, you called for here, that are not dealing in the same sphere that we are. But are part, of course, of society. So that was the topic. How can we open spaces very concretely in schools to facilitate the access to education for all? So, and we use the technology of meshwork. And that the first step is to identify all stakeholders in the process. So not just, an elite, but who should be on board to explore and discuss this topic and find solutions. So the first is really to co-sense the field of the social body in this context and to identify all stakeholders. For example, representatives of parents of pupils, of politics, because they will have to implement the decision afterwards. So we have to have the people that have the power and influence for afterwards, after the process. Sector of economic, you know, of course, the teachers and the directors of schools and the youth clubs, and so to identify them. The second step will be then within, and that's before the process starts, to make really a map of all stakeholders and to go in contact with each one, to sense into each motivation and interest, because everyone has personal interests, that's okay, and a different view of the topic. So we have to map that. We have to map the diversity of interest, of mindsets, of interpretations. And then when people come together, we start the process of meshworking. That means, in the first place, we map the interests, but also the needs. And we use, for example, also the technology of 4D mapping from the President Institute with Otto Scharmer. That is a method where we can map with the bodies, and we use the transpersonal, also the intuition, you know, connecting to the body and to a higher source of wisdom that is beyond everyone, but is still there. And we let, through the body, visualize the social body right now in the current interpretation and state. And then we let, through the body, move what is the highest potential for the social body to come forward and to go to. What could be the future interpretation? And that manifests. That's a part where we really, after mapping the stakeholders, the needs, the interests, making visible what are the main issues right now in this system. Then we look at the resources of every representative, every person in the room. What are the resources you bring? And then the key element in a meshwork process, in order to go beyond the diversity, you know, to the unity, is the formulation of an overarching goal. The overarching goal will have the potential to align and synergize all the diversity without forgetting the individual interest. So each one can find oneself in the overarching goal and realize, if I put my resources in service to the overarching goal, I will realize my own goal too. So you align and synergize. And in the moment that the overarching goal is formulated, then you go to action, prototyping, crystallizing, action plan, what we know, you know, from the ego, can do it wonderful, in a wonderful way. But to formulate the overarching goal is a crucial element in the meshwork process. And we use here the collective wisdom and the transpersonal dimensions. And people do not have to know that. We are not making it, you know, we don't name that. We have some tools method just to make it appear. And people say after, wow, it was magic. Yeah, yes. Yeah, of course it's magic. And that's a way then you can, beyond polarization, use the forces, the powers, and the diversity in the way that each one can see one's own contribution, you know, your uniqueness, but in service to something bigger. And for me, it's a spiritual work, but very pragmatic. I hope it's helpful to understand how to work in a very concrete way, locally, integrating different dimensions.
But yes, thank you very much for that. It's very enjoyable to hear you describe it so easily, actually. And it calls to mind because we've been doing a similar kind of practice in the UK, and we give it the term collaboratories. So we have a process that is, I think, very integrally informed, like yours, and we found our own language for it. And we definitely invite the arts to help people move through this space, because people can let go of differences quite easily through the use of arts and attraction and energy in the room. I'm sure you do something similar. But it also reminds me a little bit of, for those maybe in the room who would be familiar with the work of Johann Galtung and conflict transformation. The process is quite similar to conflict transformation work, and but very different language for different times and different groups of people. Could you tell me, one of the problems that we run into when we offer this kind of work is that if we come as a group of facilitators, for example, or as something recognizable, in our case, the alternative as an entity, then it's quite difficult for local groups to really own the process. And sometimes that causes them to reject what's on offer because it isn't a homegrown process. How have you got over that barrier, or maybe you haven't run into the same problem?
Yeah,
it could be a very British problem.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. And it's a key question, actually, because in my experience and in yours, certainly, in each transformational process, or where we create spaces for transformation, we will most of the time come to some resistance from people. I think it's an interesting human dimension that we are not really keen on moving, because it demands energy to move forward, to change things, to transform. It may be exhausting for people, and if things are working not so bad, why should I transform something, So we have to overcome this natural dimension in us that would prefer to stay comfortable in the state we have, even if it's dysfunctional most of the time. So the topic of resistance and rejection is, I think, always present in the transformation topic. So how to address that in a way that can be helpful? I see that behind rejection or resistance, I sense fears. I recognize and sense that might be fears behind that, or insecurity. So the first step would be to make it open and to ask, well, I'm interested in learning more about your resistance right now, or why you are afraid of, or when you say, well, it won't work and it doesn't work. Maybe you have made interesting experiencing that we can benefit from if you tell us, So not going in rejection of the rejection, but opening the space for really curiosity. We are not enough curious, So the curiosity to understand where does the rejection come from, because it might contain very interesting elements for the transformational process. So to understand that, and my experience is, if people feel acknowledged in their insecurity, then they will develop trust, for the first steps. And then in the second step, we can make visible the fears in the room, and ask, where do you see the problems or traps? And it's wonderful. We have to name that. And then if it's named and checked around reality, some reality check is just a fantasy, or is that real? Could it be real? then we can address each of the topics together and say, okay, if we have this fear or this insecurity, what do you need? I ask people, I do not give some solution, but I ask them because people know, they know everything. So you try have to ask the group, what do you need? What do we need now as a group in order to address this? What do you need? What is the next step? And so step by step. So what are the conditions? One of my favorite sentences in processes is, what do we need as conditions? The minimal conditions we need to go to the next step. And we can use the 4 quadrants, for example, in the inner, inside, in the inner, outside, in the collective, in outside, in the collective inside, you know, and people will fill that up with ideas and with their, with approaches, and because the wisdom is there.
So if you include, let's take a real life example that you described with the, creating a better education system with access for everyone during the COVID crisis, and emerging from the COVID crisis. How can you deliver on the desires of people to have better education systems? So for example, let's compare that to, I don't know, typically in the past, one of the parties would come down to a local arena, invite a similar sort of question, we want to listen to you, we want to hear what you need. And then they would, gather the data and withdraw, right? And then somewhere you hope, but you're never quite sure, that data is contributing to a policy plan somewhere. You might never hear about it again, right? How does this compare to that kind of a process? Because when you said that you also invite the politicians in the district to come, now we're getting to the political question. How do the politicians or the local ones, the councillors, whatever, interact with the people when it's very likely that the people will ask for things and need things that the political representatives cannot deliver? They simply don't have the resources. And isn't there a danger then of leaving the process frustrated or powerless? I'm saying this specifically because we tend to not, when we're doing our work, we tend to not look at the issues that exist currently in the political sphere. We tend to take them outside of that space, and we leave the process autonomous, meaning not to bring in the politicians and so on, because we're trying to awaken the, in a sense, the responsibility of people for delivering on outcomes for themselves that could then obviously be in partnership with power. Which part of this can you deliver? They might say to the council, but they won't leave it with the council to deliver on the dreams that they have started to generate. So I sense a slightly different approach, and would like to hear how you see that. How can one deliver on the things that are, on the needs that are surfaced by your process?
I can see this tension. I can acknowledge that the political systems now are, as they are, on the level of consciousness they are, have their limitations, of course. And I can also see that many people are disappointed, and deceived that the political system are not supporting what they are doing as civil society. So there is actually a tension between the political system that I think have a higher pressure, but due to the way they are operating in polarization, it's not a synergetical democracy, it's an opposition democracy. So yes. My feeling is that the political systems lose very, very much power and energy fighting each other in order to survive. So it's still the old model of survival, and affirming one party, because there are different parties and each one has to affirm in opposition to. It's the old thinking. And of course, they can't think outside the old thinking. They are there where they are, and we have to acknowledge that. So they are very busy with and spending a lot of energy and time on affirming their own position against the others, and have their limitations for that. And at the other side, they face a part of the population, not everyone. Like I think the circles we are in, who are representative of another mindset, another more complex, perhaps, comprehension of the world, and operating in a different world and different way. And those are so different that it's very difficult, at first to build a bridge. And what I see is that those communities say, okay, we are doing the work by ourselves because we can't rely to the politics. They won't help us. So there is some, but at the same time, we need for some implementation, the political and the law potential. So there is still now some dismatching between the two systems because they are operating in very different worlds of the mindset. One possibility is what you have mentioned, and it's always the responsibility of the more complex system to adapt to the other system, because the other one can't. You can't say speak French if you can't speak French,
yes,
or speak Chinese. If they can't speak the language or see the world, no chance. We can try to say them, but we won't be, it's not helpful. So it's the responsibility to the more complex system. And I don't mean with that we are better or more intelligent. It's such a different level. So, but it's our responsibility to adapt to that. And one way would be what you mentioned, to see, okay, what are the resources in the mainstream political system right now? Where are their possibility and potentials, and where are their limitations? And how can we find, the zones where we can find some support for what we do? And not more, because we know it won't be possible. And so we can save energy, and we can also acknowledge the political system, giving it a chance to contribute where it's possible for it. So that would be a way to bridge it until we have political systems that have transformed.
But let me put another idea to you, only because here we are in this conversation. So what about where, I don't know if you were familiar with the idea that Vaclav Havel brought into the political space before he became a politician. Actually, he was living and working as an artist and a theatre director in Czechoslovakia while it was still part of a strong communist regime. And he developed this notion of the parallel polis. And the parallel polis was really an act of the imagination. And he said to the people around him, even though we can't be free, we can imagine that we are. And let's design for a world in which we are free. And that developed, it became a very popular thing to do in and around him and within his networks, where there was actively designing for a world that himself and Vaclav Bender, they were two partners in this exploration. And they went into great detail with their networks. What kind of a foreign policy would we have? What kind of a social policy would we have? And they built the whole thing in their imagination. And when it changed, when the communist regime, lifted from Czechoslovakia, Vaclav Havel was a popular person, and he was, as you know, then became the president. And the interesting thing is what happened next, because it wasn't this more Leninist idea, that this new system or this new idea would just take over the old one. What he experienced was that the old system, or even any system that existed that was part of an international idea of what politics and governance looks like, couldn't really hold this parallel polis. In reality, it was not developed enough. It wasn't ready for this really more creative, artistic, emotionally rich space. So in a way, our response to that is to sense that the parallel polis has to keep developing all the time as a parallel polis. But what is interesting about these times, and has been interesting since the birth of the internet, is that it's given us the ability to make our imagination real, right? So we can connect at the ideas level, but we can experiment on the ground in the communities that we're living. We're free to do that. And over the last 3 decades, that's what's been happening in our view, that there is this other world really taking shape. The way we describe it is cosmolocally, so not just local, meaning small and flat and disconnected, but meaningful, but cosmolocally means connected to many other communities around the world that are doing the same, sharing tools, really bringing up this possibility of another world altogether. So, let me just invite you to say where your work at the Center for Human Emergence and in the work of working with, for example, the Presencing Institute, can you see this reality also taking shape? That there is something there is another world that is taking shape. Really, in a way, there's a word for it that we use. It's like hidden in plain sight, right? It's like you can see it, but you can't see it. It's absolutely there in front of you. But because the media doesn't describe it, and because it's not accepted by our current political system, the discourse isn't really landed. But it exists, in a kind of a parallel way. And how do we bring these two things into, well, really, for me, it's more like a partnership between the old system and the new system. It's not they don't need to really become each other. We don't, in the 10 years that we have for the climate crisis, do we have time for that? A good partnership surely is good enough. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for those beautiful insights. Well, when I look at it with an evolutionary perspective and look really the way we have always in the past 100,000 years shift from one system to the next more complex level, I see all this as waves that overlaps, so that in each era there was always a mainstream, and the mainstream has each paradigm has a wave, emergent, and you have a peak where it's a mainstream, and then it goes downwards, but the next wave is appearing. And I see that we are exactly in these two waves overlapping each other. So we still possibly have a mainstream in the modern paradigm, because, as you told, the media, the mainstream media, just share those little fans of reality, you know, ignoring all other parallel worlds. That's really interesting to observe, because if you are just focused on mainstream media, you think, oh, that's the real world. And if you are connected with internet and are aware of all those other realities and worlds that are operating, you say, wow, no, there are much more than that. But I see that with my friends, you know, if you just read always the same papers and just TV, you think that's it. That's it. And they are not aware that the next wave is there, you know. So we are in the overlapping of waves. And the mainstream in the evolution doesn't stay mainstream for all the time. And we see the mainstream last 80,000 years in the tribal society, then 7,000 years in one, then 700 years, then 50 years. So the peak of the mainstream is getting shorter, shorter and shorter. So that means that what the reality from the media is already obsolete, but they are not aware of that. No, but it's okay. That's a chance for the other initiative. But because I don't think, my personal conception, I don't think that that we can transform the system right now from inside. That won't be possible, because there are so much topics around power that are not resolved. So what I see is that the next wave, like the evolution of all those initiative organizations that operates in a wonderful way, new way, will make the old one obsolete. We won't have to fight them, because the old one won't be you know, sustainable. It's just about sustainable, and evolution tends to sustainability, you know.
So given the I like the confidence of the wave theory, right? And I would, you know, really want to invest in that for sure. But give me a sense of for you how you evidence that this new wave will really become the mainstream in time. Because we find that it causes very different behavior, doesn't it? When people think there is nothing to do, they tend to withdraw into themselves or withdraw into any kind of you know, interest group or new community that gives them some kind of hope that on their own they can make it in some way. I think you know what it is. They're happy to exist in a counter to society, but it isn't necessarily you know, invested in something that's right for everyone. You know, it's sort of like there's a lot of breakaway energy from the collapsing old systems that are proving themselves, let's face it, to be invested in what has destroyed the planet, right? And it makes its appearance in so many different ways. But the breakaway groups tend to be quite self-interested. You know, people like us, they want to find the other people like us, right? And they're not really invested as much in what you're describing, and certainly what we're describing all the time, is that the key to a new way of being is to be fully diverse, is to include people who aren't usually included, is to go beyond your own comfort zone and your own usual suspects, you know, is to prize all of that. So in that commotion, you know, that the internet, you know, really does make possible, the breakaway groups, so many breakaway groups of people just trying to survive on their own in a way, or just wanting to be amongst people who agree with them. And there is even a tendency in that, there's a possibility in that with integral practitioners even, who break away and only speak to people who they think are also integral thinkers. We're all human, this is a human dynamic, and I've seen it happen everywhere. So how would you evidence this next wave that you are investing in and that I'm investing in, that it's actually coming, that there is this new possibility of many people tapping into something that is universal, and that would connect with groups around the world who are also doing. There's a lot of evidence that we're bringing up every time, and we're trying to create media for the connectivity between these things happening all over the world. But how would you evidence it from your work that bigger, more holistic wave is coming?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once is, of course, we have no guarantee that it comes. My confidence comes from the fact that when I look at the design of evolution in the past 100,000 years, we know that between the paradigm that there was many crises. The French Revolution, for example, it was terrible, and it was a period of time of 200 years from the revolution until the first form of democracy. So we are speaking on very long periods of time. So there were always crises, and you had never the guarantee that it works, that the shift to the next one will happen. But it happened for some reason. We did it. So if I stay in this confidence in the design of evolution and trust on this yearning towards more freedom, consciousness, love, and evolution, then I can trust in the process. So, but we have no guarantee. Of course, we can also go in a totally regression, in a survival modus. It's also a possibility. And many tell or think that we are going to a regression. And we see right now what we have described, some groups are withdrawing, and self-supporting, but are not interested in the big. It's just a survival modus. They want to protect themselves, because if you really surrender to the bigger, well, it's a big thing, wow. Sometimes I also wish I would go to the desert, and I don't want to hear and see anything more, and just want to be by myself. So of course it's a big thing, and you have to develop the courage to surrender to this and to contribute to that. And I can really understand with compassion that many say, wow, it's too much for me. I have to protect myself and regress. So all these movements, dynamics right now are so powerful, the old systems that try to hold the old, then the one who would go to survival modus, then some like us say, no, we trust. So everything come now to those tensions. And as Erwin Laszlo, the great systemic thinker, he said, the good news is that we don't need a lot of people to make the shift. A small percentage is enough. In the chaos window, he named that, he called that the chaos window. And we are right now in the chaos window. That's such an exciting period of life. My gosh, well, I'm happy to be here, even if it's hard and challenging. But we are exactly in the chaos windows. And I think also the corona and everything is an evolutionary driver. It's an evolutionary driver. It's hard. And I'm sorry that so many people have lost their life, but it's in service to the evolution. So we are in this chaos window. And in this chaos window, a slight movement of 3% of the world population could be enough to shift the whole system in the new. So we have to focus on this energetically, you know, to focus on this opportunity for the shift, and really not to let us get to regression and despair and, you know, and doubts, because it feeds the old system.
Mm.
We can focus on the confidence, the trust for the new, realizing that the smallest contribution can make the difference, you know, then we can do that.
Mm. Thank you. So I think we've come more or less to the end of our hour, but I wonder if there's anything, I mean, I feel there's much more that we can pick up and ask from you. Maybe if you could just come back to the beginning, to describe how you see a new politics arising from this. In what way, what kind of governance system can you imagine appearing within this next wave? Are there any clues that you can point at? And maybe in some way it's related to your, you know, education system that you're already putting into force. So yes, please share that.
Yeah. Well, and I what I share could just be the one next step, you know, because I sense there are so many possibilities that we couldn't yet imagine will appear. But what next step could be the step from this opposition democracy to synergetical democracy. So we need the diversity. It hasn't to be the way that we name parties, you know, but we need the diversity because life is diversity. So we have to map this diversity also in governance. But what my vision would be is that if we manage that when we are different and bring differences in the space, we do not have to fight against the other. You know, that's the point. And we don't have to be afraid of losing power when we come together, because I think the main issue in the politics right now that is not addressed and that I would love to address is power. What is our understanding of power? And how does it relate to the feminine and the masculine? As long as we are not addressing the power topic, we won't really be able to develop something new. So if we can release the idea of power over and transform the narrative in, I have power for or in service to, that's the basis. Then from this new narrative of power, we can start to integrate the differences in service to. And that's it. That's very simple, you know, but it means that we have first to develop this consciousness in us that is not focused on power over of this patriarchal system that is obsolete and updated, and it's no longer helpful. It was helpful. I want to criticize, but we need a new narrative around power, and from this new narrative we can create totally different political systems based on diversity and integration. Losing fear, we have to lose fear.
So this is a great starting point for our next conversation.
Yes.
Because I feel that what we're exploring as much as we can in each of the communities that we work, you know, this idea, I think maybe we describe it as agency as well. Where is our agency? Because that shifts the idea of power into something that I can own and I can contribute, and I can use really in my own search for how to make change happen. But it's everything that we're looking at the very much similar same space, and I really appreciate the way that you described the shift. So just finally then, is the Center of Human Emergence doing these experiments specifically yet, or do you feel this is something that needs to happen and would like to emerge more? These experiments in power, this new exploration of and what kind of a governance system could support this new emerging power in communities?
Yeah, we have tried to implement it in our operating system, the Center of Human Emergence from the beginning. For example, we have no legal status. So it was very conscious that I proposed that we release from all those names, in order to be free to co-create and let emerge new forms of trying out what works, what doesn't work, So we have tried as a microcosm, a microcosmos to test it and to check in the way we come together, the way we have no leader, So of course we are doing that, embodying that, but on a very small scale. And I experience in that probably like you in all other initiatives, organization, where we work in a very efficient way, but without leaders or without the old structures, with hierarchy. So there are many existing forms of governance right now that work very holacracy or sociocracy, so methods and tools that we can try out and experiment. But of course, it's just the beginning. So I think that we will develop that on the road, walking, when we walk the talk, then we are developing all this, and there is much more to come.
Sounds amazing, Claudine. Thank you so much. And as I said, I feel this is, conversation will come back to again and again. It seems to be so much developing there where you are. And it would be great to compare how similar things are happening around the world, or similar patterns of emergence, maybe let's put it that way, might have different language, might take different forms, but are somehow showing the same signs of an evolved politics, the way you've just begun to describe it. So thank you very much indeed, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Indra, for your wonderful holding the space and for your wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.